Okay, cool. Thank you very much for the time to present this. So as Mark said, this is a May 2020 update of Starlink analysis that has been ongoing for a while. What started out as sort of a pandemic distraction has turned into 2 years worth of analysis and data collection. So basically, I've already presented updates on how SpaceX is handling Starlink in the past. At the end of this, you'll see some QR codes for links to those up on YouTube. But so for now, I'm just going to go through what's changed since the last time I've spoken here and go through some of the more interesting developments in the constellation itself and the intra-constellation analysis. But for people that haven't seen those first ones, an important note is that all of the source data that's used for this analysis is publicly available TLEs that I've obtained from Celestrak or SpaceTrack. Sometimes you can't get it from Celestrak, and I'll pick things up at SpaceTrack. But the nice thing about Celestrak is they have the supplemental catalog, which are TLEs that are directly generated from the SpaceX EFEMs that the company provides to the 18th Space Control Squadron or Space Defense Squadron, whatever it is now. And so those TLEs are actually really good. But then those are only for essentially the operational ones. And if their data for a particular satellite is not in the supplemental catalog, then I have to just kind of revert to the nominal catalog, which is really just a reflection of the SpaceTrack catalog. And as Mark mentioned, questions can go to in the chat and he'll bring them up at the end. So in a glance, the original shell that was originally slated for 550 kilometers, previously late last year, they lowered to 547.5. That constellation was completed back in August, and it's going strong. There's plenty of spares. They're slotted for 18 satellites per plane, but most have 20. So they have even above and beyond the 18 plus 2 spares for the main constellation that's up right now at 547. But they've also been continuing, and they have 21 planes out of the 72 for the next layer of the constellation, the next shell down, which is at 540 kilometers mean altitude. And right now they are about 20% done. You can see where the planes are that they have populated. Some have full complements, others just have a few still, and it's continuing apace. I would like to put together a visualization that shows everything. That there's just so much data, it's kind of hard to distill down, and I haven't come up with something I like yet, so I'm just going with 2 separate things for the time being. Overall, at a slightly more granular detail, what is the current status? And I was actually able to update this today, and they've launched 2,600 satellites on the button, and of those, 2,333 are in the active Celestrak catalog. As I said, they've completed the 547 shell back in August, and there are about 287 satellites in the 540 kilometer shell, and this plot shows the apogees and perigees of everything, just basically, sequentially in time. And you can see that the majority are up at the mission altitude of 547. You can see the drop down to the 540 shell here, and then there's a bunch that are being raised right now. It's on the order of 100 or so. The light green lines are the space station nominal altitude range. So you can see they actually park some just below station before going past to make sure they do so safely. The 2 launches from within the last 3 days are actually right here at the very tail end. They are on their way to raising up to the basic parking orbit at just above 350. And all of this stuff over here are failures, deorbits, one-off sort of anomalies that we don't really know about. But there's kind of always been a little bit of detritus here. But over time, as SpaceX likes to promise, they drag, cleans this area and pulls them down, and there are Starlinks re-entering periodically. And so it's never really gotten too congested or crowded with a lot of detritus. So fortunately, they've been true to their word. They've actively deorbited a lot of stuff over time. I don't have exact numbers on that, but my main focus has just kind of been their operational constellation. Another way to look at the operational constellation that I've found to be very informative is looking at it, basically, if you kind of took that 3D view and folded it out flat. So each plane of the constellation is one of the vertical lines, and their delta right ascension of their node is across the bottom. So I have assigned a plane 1 from their very early deployments as kind of the 0 point, and then everything else is measured relative to that. Even the newer shell, the 540 shell, which I apologize, it's a bit of an eye chart, but it's kind of almost unavoidable at this point. There's so many satellites, but the 540 shell that's being populated now is all these green lines that are tucked in between all the blue lines, and you can see that they are tucking them in right in between the 547 shell planes. So with 72 planes, they're separated by 5 degrees, and so you shift the planes or the shells by 2.5 degrees, and you've got everything staggered. I'm pretty sure there's no flight dynamics reason for that. I think it's mainly for ground coverage, but I don't know for sure. They don't. SpaceX is reasonably good about being open with communications, but they obviously don't share everything about their operations. And so, yeah, they're filling in the quote unquote gaps. It's already pretty dense as is, but they're filling it in. And an astute advisor might notice that, well, if the two shells are at different altitudes, won't the RAN between these shells drift? And the answer is yes, they absolutely will. But they're stacked in so tightly that the RAN drift is really less than a millidegree a day. And with that, it'll take more than 11 years for the planes to drift and line up exactly underneath each other on this plot. And in the end, I don't think there's any flight dynamics impact to that. I think it's really just for coverage, and I don't think it's probably not a huge coverage impact there either. So 11 years is a long time, but for the amount of satellites they've launched, I would hope that it's also not a long time, that they're interested in operating things responsibly 10, 15, 20 years down the road. And I mentioned before that the 540 shell was just below, and it is just below, but given the eccentricity of 0.001 of the orbits, if you look closely at that apogee and perigee plot where the two shells are kind of demarcated, you can see that actually the apogees of the 540 shell over on the kind of lower right here are actually above the perigees of the original 547 shell. And so again, an astute observer might say, well, isn't that problematic from a CA perspective? It's bad enough that you've got 1,440 satellites crossing each other, 55,116 times a day, or whatever the number is. And you don't want them to interact with each other. So isn't that really bad from a CA perspective? But given that all the planes are frozen orbits and they're all at essentially the same inclination, the apogees and perigees occur for both at the same latitude. And so when the satellites happen to be at a crossing at the same location at the same time, that's occurring at the same latitude as well by necessity. And so an easy way to look at that is to just plot the argument of latitude, which gets rid of argument of perigee issues and mean anomaly vagaries, and look at the argument of latitude, the spherical altitude as a function of argument of latitude. You can see that the shells do not interact. So what I did was, the blue line is this 3079, which is from the 540 kilometer shell, and then the rest, I took 4 satellites, the nearest neighbors, so to speak, from the 547 kilometer shell, these 4 guys shown in the dots here, or in the circle here. And you can see at their altitudes, they have a radial separation of multiple kilometers at all times. And certainly there will be vagaries of this in terms of the argument of perigee is controlled, but not controlled super tightly. There is some wobble of a few degrees in where the argument of perigee is, right? And so it's not just directly at 90 right at the bottom. And so that interior, but given the spacing, you can see that interior ellipse can rotate in argument of perigee by a lot and not risk having interactions between the planes. So even though they're stacked very closely together, they're doing so in a responsible way, and as long as they work to maintain the constellation well, there shouldn't be any difficulties there and concerns of interactions between the different shells. So moving on to the conjunction analysis, to kind of take a step, from the beginning and kind of just explain how I'm tracking the intra-constellation conjunctions, is I start with basically the NASA standard prediction for, or conjunction analysis for robotic missions, where you look out 7 days, look at what I call a 25-kilometer box. It's 25 kilometers long track, 5 kilometers radial, 5 kilometers cross track, and anything that comes within that volume is something you track and worry about and consider. But since SpaceX is in control of all these satellites, I'm just looking at Starlink v. Starlink. They don't really need to look out that far. They can predict where their stuff is going to be to a better degree. They don't need to worry so much about 7 days out. So I also look at a 3-day prediction window, and since they know the covariances of these things very well, I look at a smaller box too, a 5 kilometer long track, 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer. And so between those 2 different box sizes and 2 different prediction lengths, I have four CA statistics that I'm tracking, and they're shown, broken out spatially on this plot, so you can get an idea of where they are. And so then doing that over time, you can assess trends and suss out more things from the data. And the size of these other boxes was pretty arbitrary. I chose them based on what kind of made sense to me from looking at these plots. And so I want to show a little video that shows basically from last July through now of just how the conjunction predictions have looked over time. And I know there's a lot of color flashing. That really is just that's vestigial from early on when I set up the analysis back in the early pandemic days of looking at the latitude to see, well, which plane crossing was this actually coming from? Just because I wanted to see if there was any trends to be found there, and just over time, it's kind of become less important. And so, because you can see the broader trend is really that there's a large grouping of stuff that kind of stays at this 2.5 to 3 day range out in the future. And to me, this appears to be that this is what is SpaceX operational threshold, that they're worried about controlling in this 3-day range, and really worried about controlling, you can see down in the lower reaches where it's getting within a day or so and a few kilometers. That's really the space they want to keep clean. And actually in the last 6 months, it's kind of hard to see, but I can show better on later plots. The data in this 1 to 3 day range has cleared out a bit, and it's a little bit masked by all of the data in all these conjunctions in the 2.5 to 3 day range. But you can, if you look at the data a little differently, which I'll show in a minute, you can suss out a little bit more of what's going on. And so clearly there's lots of conjunctions, lots of predicted conjunctions, but obviously they're not hitting each other all the time. So SpaceX's system is working hard to keep things clear. And when you take all those plots and just count up all those points and plot them as on a chart over time, you get this. And this is on a log scale, and this is all these vertical lines are when each new plane was added to the original constellation. I don't have statistics for the new shell yet. I needed to make some updates to my code to do that, and I'm going to be doing that shortly. But for the time being, this is a good representation of what's going on. The humps here in the longer term conjunctions are actually from when SpaceX reconfigured their shell, which my previous presentation discussed in more detail. But the important thing is that these conjunction trends really followed the number of plane crossings. As that went up quadratically, so did the conjunctions, and then it's held. They've not kind of increased, even though they aren't adding more shells or more planes to this shell, which is a good sign. And it's showing stability. It's kind of behaving the way you would want. The purple, which is the worst of the worst, the 3 days and 5 kilometers, that's leveled off and even dropped in a little bit. And I'll show in a certain way how it has actually improved in the last few months. So from a CA perspective, one of the big concerns that I've always had is failures at the mission orbit. Dead satellites in the main constellation has always seemed like a big problem. And so I've been able to track that a little bit over time, it's initially it increased. They had kind of some higher infant mortalities, and it peaked at 18 satellites and had kind of a mainstream peak of 16, 17 over a several month period. But then, as you can see, over the last few months, it's really started to drop off as they've started to decay out of the constellation. And the nice thing is this has implications for how things behave over time. And when you look at, I tracked the conjunctions that were associated with non-maneuverable satellites, and if you track that ratio over time, what you see actually for those 3-day short-term predictions for the smaller box, initially non-maneuvering satellites, being the orange trend here, showed a significant dominance of those short-term conjunctions, and the maneuverable versus maneuverable conjunctions that are much more easily avoided were not in there because they were maintaining their orbits and staying out of each other's way. But when you look at the non-maneuverable stuff, that has dropped significantly over time. And while the time period is not exactly matching on this, you can see that this is dropping out kind of earlier. And there's a little blip here of where it comes back up, and I'll explain that in a minute. But basically, their conjunctions with these non-maneuverable satellites has really fallen off, and that's to their decaying. But I do want to make a note of how do I determine failures, because it actually shows some difficulty in the data. As I said, SpaceX is pretty good about being transparent in a lot of ways, but they don't talk about everything. And some of these satellites are it's been difficult to say whether they're maneuvering or not. And sometimes I'm able to my code's set up to catch when something moves from the supplemental catalog, where it's based on their EFEMs, to moving into the nominal catalog. So that's usually an indicator of a failure, but not always. And then other resources like Jonathan McDowell, whose Twitter handle is right there, also will say that they've identified a failure. And a lot of times you can see, based on the maintenance of the semi-major axis, you can see for this particular one a slow decay over time. And as the satellite decays, it just becomes less and less of a problem from a CA perspective. Even just getting any sort of semi-major axis and perigee change helps reduce the severity and impact of any predicted conjunctions. But it's not perfect. Here's one that was satellite 1204 that was marked as a failure, and from about the time when they lowered the original shell. And you can see that there is a clear difference in the semi-major axis control. It starts, eccentricity varies more, and the semi-major axis begins to decay, but clearly it started maneuvering down at some point, and so it was deorbited. So SpaceX still had control of it. They just weren't doing semi-major axis control, at least to the same tolerance they were before. And so it got marked as a failure, but really was maneuverable. And so, and now is out of the main constellation. So it's really challenging. And then actually the two most recent failures are also sort of curious. Again, these moved from the supplemental catalog to the nominal, and so my code automatically detected a failure date as this time period. And you can see it was at the original 550 and then dropped down to 547 and has been holding very tightly. And then suddenly it starts decaying after it moved out of the supplemental catalog. And it's hard to say. That's not a nominal power descent, but it's also faster than these other decays. So perhaps it's just increased drag. You can see the slope changes over time for 1126. So perhaps this is just increased drag. Maybe they haven't had an operational change where they are changing the drag profile of the satellite to reduce its decay time. I'm not sure. Again, don't know all their operations, but it's interesting academically nonetheless. And then finally, what's interesting is, as I've said, these conjunctions due to these non-maneuvering satellites has really fallen off. It fell off to near zero for a while, and then, hey, what's this blip here? That's actually those last two failures that I showed you. Once my code marked it as failed, then the number of short-term conjunctions jumped up again as they started to decay. But then once they got some SMA difference, as I mentioned, then the period and SMA difference just kind of cleans it out of the prediction thresholds, and things fell off again. And so it's looking very clear again. So in conclusion, they're moving like gangbusters still. The original shell still complete. They're maintaining it. It seems healthy. The 540 kilometer shell is about 20% complete, and they're tucking them in very tight, but seemingly being responsible about it, which is also good. And the launches continue apace. I just had to update my slides today, otherwise I'd have been 2 launches behind, because they launched twice in the last 3 days, and my numbers would be off by 106 satellites. And as I've been discussing, the non-maneuvering spacecraft have been a significant driver of the what I would consider to be the more dangerous conjunctions, the closer term and closer range conjunctions, but they're decaying out and things are looking better. It's survivable. And the stuff that right now, everything I showed is things that have decayed out of the 547, but obviously that means it's going to be decaying down through the 540 shell. But given that their periods they're not going to be so evenly matched as they go down, I don't think it's going to be a major problem. And they've already demonstrated with the 547 shell that they can safely stay away from them as they're coming down. So I think the failures within the shells appear to be survivable, and their system is seemingly robust to handle it, which is fantastic because we'd all like to use LEO. And so if people are interested in some of the background, the QR codes to my 2 previous presentations are right here. Feel free to take time to just make a snapshot of them, and that's my presentation. Any questions?
Cool. Yeah. Thanks, Michael. We do have a couple questions from the audience. The first one is, are you using the built-in oscillating elements to plot the apogee height and perigee height here, or do you have functions that calculate the invariant apogee and perigee height in these plots?
So I'm using the Brouwer-Ladane J2 elements, which are still technically oscillating in a they're a mean element set. So they do vary because obviously the Earth has more than just J2, but it smooths out a lot. And actually, SpaceX recently published some information on how they do their ascent and descent planning, and actually they mentioned specifically that they use Brouwer-Ladane elements as well as part of their control system. So that's what I'm using, and I used it because it helps smooth things out and was a convenient way to look at it for my analysis.
Okay. The next one is, there's been some discussion in the space traffic management community of orbital carrying capacity. How many satellites do you think can safely fit in one of these type of shells?
That's a good question. I would say, it's hard to tell. One thing where these shells are going to have the biggest impact is any sort of low thrust ascent. If you're launching, and you just go through the shell really quickly, you can essentially just kind of target something to squeak through the RAN and inclination gaps. But if you're doing a staged descent where you're doing so slowly, depending on how quickly you go, you're going to have to carefully plan how you go through that shell, and you're going to have on the order of a week or 2 weeks, depending on how quickly you can do it, of some high blood pressure, I guess is the way I would say it, where you're trying to get through. I don't know what the density is that's achievable. Clearly 1,440 in one altitude band is doable so far. It's really a question of, I think, how responsible they are at making sure they don't have a bunch of satellites that fail in the mission orbit. It's good. It's really good that their early infant mortalities have decayed out. Hopefully they're proactive in removing things that are suspect prior to actually losing maneuvering capability. But I don't know. It's kind of, trust the operator.
It's a tough question. So the next one we have is, I noticed that in the CA time lapse, there were a few days that were almost linear lines for one specific series. Does that signify a launch? He said the lines were typically around the 15-kilometer mark between 0 and 2 elapsed days, or what is that feature?
So yeah, you're seeing like arcs or something like that. Yeah, what those are is actually where, for whatever idiosyncratic reason, two particular spacecraft had a very evenly matched period, and they just happened to be close enough that they were in each other's box. So you get all these repeating conjunctions for a particular spacecraft. And so the more evenly the period is matched, the flatter that parabola becomes. And so because it's hard to see, but most of the, since those were absolute value ranges, most of those, any repeating conjunctions show up as kind of a V pattern that is actually fairly steep because the period's not matched super closely. They don't seem to be worried about matching the period really tightly. They just kind of bounce them around in their boxes and let them go. So those arcs are just where the periods are matched, and you get a bunch of repeating conjunctions for a specific